Welcome to Conversations with Authors and Innovators, our timely recorded conversations with authors, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs. My co-host and partner in crime, Doug Banks, the executive editor from the Boston Business Journal, is here as well. Welcome, Doug.
Hey, Larry, how are you?
I'm terrific. Today, Doug and I talk with Tess Wilkinson Ryan, professor at the University of Pennsylvania Carey School of Law. Professor Wilkinson Ryan has a law degree and a doctorate in psychology and is the author of the must-read book we're going to talk about today, Foolproof: How Fear of Playing the Sucker Shapes Ourselves and the Social Order and What We Can Do About It. Welcome, Tess. So excited that you're here. Really enjoyed the book. I learned a new word reading your book, agoraphobia, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. What is it? Why do we all seem to struggle with it, and why does it matter?
Okay, great. So the word, I don't know how to pronounce either. I think that, that we're probably the first people to say this out loud, except for the original authors of a great paper that I highly recommend called, the paper is called Feeling Duped, and it's by Kathleen Vose, Jason Chin, and Roy Baumeister. And the paper is about the sort of universal fear of feeling suckered.
Okay.
And the idea is most people really don't like to feel like a dupe or a chump. And they dislike that feeling in like outsized proportion to the actual harm that flows from the particular scam.
And I liked how you introduced this in the book. You gave some great examples. Your sister buying Gatorade from a convenience store, saying, "I'm not paying those prices," but you sort of brought it into our day-to-day lives, our day-to-day situations, and for our CEOs, entrepreneurs, and investors who are watching this and thinking about this book, you're level setting. And I think from what I got really from the beginning was your decisions, your framing starts with the idea that somebody somewhere could be putting something over on you. And how does that, because you've talked a lot over the course of your career about, you teach contracts.
I do.
About how business people ought to think about entering into those discussions and maybe trying to understand their biases before they even start.
Yeah, one of the things I was trying to get at was the idea that there's both a sort of rational, sensible component to the fear of being scammed, right? It's not a ridiculous thing to be afraid of. You, in fact, should not like just hand over all your money to any old person who asks for it, especially if they have like a really fishy story about why they want it, right? That's totally reasonable. On the other hand, when you're trying to make financial decisions, for example, about, sort of what to invest in, right? You usually you want to ask, am I being more risk averse than I should be, right? Because I'm afraid I'm going to come out looking or feeling foolish. So one of the studies that I cited in the book that I think sort of gives some texture to it, it's a study that basically said to people, look, imagine you have $100 to invest in a company. And we can give you some stats about what's happening in this company. One of the stats is, look, the most likely outcome here is that everyone's just going to break even. Investors are going to,
Right.
80% odds you're going to break even. 15% odds you're going to double your investment. Okay, that's pretty good. And then 5% you're going to lose everything. Well, that's the sort of downside risk. And the question for subjects was how much of your money are you willing to invest in this company? But half of them heard that the 5% downside risk was a risk of a mistake that the founders made. They overestimated consumer demand. And half of them heard the mistake that you might be making is that the founders are fraudsters. And people were way less willing to invest in the company when there was a chance that the founders were fraudsters. And like, there are rational stories to tell about that, but I'm not sure they really hold up to scrutiny. Like, of course, there's always a risk of that, right? And so depending on the way you describe the risk, that like sudden increase in risk aversion, I think it speaks to something that's not fully rational or sort of deliberative on the part of the decision maker.
Interesting. Doug, you write about you cover these stories all the time, and somehow people feel worse when they feel worse about the math and the odds.
Yeah, yeah. So Tess, what you just talked about, that sort of innate, almost primordial drive to not be scammed. I loved in your book how you sort of take the micro, which is how do I respond when someone cuts me off in traffic? Do I take it as a like an insult, or
Yeah.
am I feeling generous that day? And I said, no, no, let you go. And then you widen it to the macro, where you talk about the weaponization of this, as in some of the replacement theory politics we're seeing today, or a lot of the Trump campaign really strategy of creating this sort of feeling that of fear that people then respond to without even realizing it. And what my curiosity, so I liked how you went with both, but my question for you is, what's your hope or goal that readers will come away with? Is it, talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about that, the opportunity cost of not necessarily, helping someone in need, or not recognizing when we're responding out of that, sugarophobia versus
Yeah.
more rational thought.
Yeah. So my, best case scenario is that people feel more equipped or empowered to sort of right size their fear, right? So that you kind of get it to the right place. I think about this a little bit. I make this comparison a lot in the book, in part because it resonates for me, which is the analogy between the fear of being a sucker and my personal fear of snakes, which it also kind of works as a metaphor, right? Because snakes are like one of the things, whatever. Metaphorically, snakes are sneaky, right? but like one of the things I would hope in this world is that is that my fear of snakes doesn't get so alleviated that I'm going up and like petting venomous snakes, right? I don't want to be like utterly impervious to sort of the fear of snakes, but I would like to be able to go hiking and not be like so vigilant that I can't enjoy the walk. Right?
Or driving down the street and stopping the van and rolling up the windows because I don't know what.
Did you?
Did you
That's
think they were going to jump in the van? That was my question when I
okay.
read.
Yeah, no, that's exactly my husband and kids could not get over that. Yes, we saw this. We were like, in these back roads of Maryland, and I. I mean, I grew up in Maine, and I think that there's not as many big snakes in Maine or something. And so we see this black snake on this dirt road, and I was like, "What do I do?" So I stopped the car and just rolled up all the windows. And my husband was like, "What do you envision this snake is possibly going to do? He's not trying to jump into our car. Like, what good is being?" Anyway, you know what? The utility my family derived from this scenario is obviously worth the humiliation for me. I'm glad I could provide them with this material.
But it really does speak to us, to our inability to control our natural reaction to things.
Yeah.
Like in your case, and both of you guys are lawyers, right? So I guess it's job security for you when you have clients that are irrationally responding to something that, had they responded rationally to it, you might not need a lawyer to negotiate a contract with such ferocity, maybe.
No, one of the first studies I did was about divorce bargaining. And I mean, the studies was in the hypothetical, but you could see even in the hypothetical, people getting really worked up about the idea that somebody who had been like morally wronged, so in a divorce, if one party feels that oftentimes both parties feel this way, but one party feels like I am sort of on the moral right side of this break, right? And then they felt like they were being asked to like share property evenly, and they felt like this was a way of making them the chump. Like, I didn't, like, here I am, I have been on the sort of losing end of this relationship, and now I have to pretend that everything is equal and give away half my stuff. And people were really resistant to that in ways that made it hard for them in ways that you could see were going to lead to things like just pouring money into litigation, right? Like, they were going to be willing to litigate these claims to the hilt. And I've now that I've sort of talked to people about this book all the time, I hear a lot of stories like this from lawyers.
Yeah.
I love the example you gave of sort of the $10 and two people, one person offering, the other person being
Yes.
the
Yes.
person who accepts it, and how we'll talk about that. Such
Yes.
a great
Yeah.
example.
Yes.
People are cool with 5 and 5. Great.
Yes.
Here's 5 of my 10, but.
Yes. No. This game. I'm gonna describe this thing called the ultimatum game. And the ultimatum game is just an experimental like lab protocol that's meant to sort of illustrate some basic economic or behavioral economic sort of findings. Basically, the gist is that you've got two people. They're told that they're paired up. They don't actually see each other in a typical game. They're just told like you're paired with participant number 47 who's in the other room. And then one of the two people in the pair is given $10 and told, you can propose any division of this $10, including 0 and 10, between you and your partner. If your partner accepts the division, then you guys both actually get that money and you leave. So if you propose like 5 and 5, you each take your 5 and go home. And if your partner rejects the $10, rejects the offer, then you both go home with nothing.
Sounds a lot like negotiating.
Exactly. And you can imagine if you're but it's a one shot. That's why it's called an ultimatum game, right? There's nothing you can do. All you can do is say yes or no if you're the receiver, the responder. And so the responding party, in theory, on like a sort of old school economic model of how people behave, if I'm offered $1 out of $10, I should say yes, because $1 is more than $0.
Yeah.
And you're
I
still
like
gonna
dollars.
you're going to walk out with $1 more than you had at the beginning, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think if you like envision humans participating in this, you can see what happens, right? Everyone's happy with 5-5. Once you get down to 7-3, like half the responders are bailing. And then once you get to 8-2 and 9-1, like you can basically forget it, right? It's very, very few people who are saying yes because they're willing to give up the $2 or the $1 in order to basically be like, no way, I'm not your chump. Like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've wrestled with this dynamic with Doug, in fact. So yeah, it's we tried it just before the call. I still have the $10. So we want to ask as well, Tess, what are you reading these days? And I know Doug is reading a million things, of course, but Tess, what are you reading? And what do you want people to think about as they're selecting reading in addition to reading Foolproof?
I have been reading a couple things, and at the moment, because I'm at the like crescendo of my semester, they're a little on the they're
You're reading exam.
relevant, yeah, the pre-exams, but sort of trying to like teach as much material as I can before the semester ends. So one thing I'm reading is I actually have it here. I'll show it to you. Is this? You can see I'm tabbing it. Is this book You Have More Influence Than You Think?
I love that book. We
It's
had her
great.
Authors and Innovators.
Oh, she's great.
She's wonderful.
It's
Yeah.
a great book. It's such an interest. So I came to reading that book because I love some of her work on consent and compliance. She has this amazing studies about people who think that they're not going to comply with basic requests, and then they do in like huge numbers, and it really changed how I thought. I mean, especially as a person who does contracts, it changed a lot how I think about like consent and assent. So I love it. The other thing I'm reading, which I don't think I have it right here, but is which I'm reading for the third time, is this book Lower Ed. Lower Ed is by Tressie McMillan Cottom, and she also wrote the book Thick, which I loved. But Lower Ed is a book. I think it must have come out of maybe her dissertation research or her early, she's a sociologist, and she was writing about the sociology of for-profit higher education, and it's just a really unusual, interesting book. Incredibly well written. I've had students read it before. It's for consumer law purposes, but like it really gives this complicated view of a dynamic about people paying for education to for-profit institutions and having to navigate how what is the status of these institutions within our educational culture. Anyway, it's great. Highly recommend.
Book. Doug, what are you reading?
So I just finished a book that actually has echoes of what you've written about, Tess, which is Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And I couldn't stop thinking about Heather McGhee's reference of the drained pool theory. She gives this great example, this sort of classic example of the closing of public pools, especially in the South, because they were having to desegregate and allow black people to use the pools, and therefore they decided to shut down public pools completely, and this otherwise public benefit is no longer available to white or black because of the sentiment at the time. And I just the more I was reading your book, I kept thinking about this drained pool theory and how the Sum of Us really explores this dynamic where we're willing to hurt us ourselves as a society in order to punish a small minority that we see. And again, it sort of brings up that replacement theory conversation that we keep reading about today.
It's why Tess's book resonates. I just finished Poverty by America, Matthew Desmond's latest book. For those of you who might have read his first book, Evicted, which won the Pulitzer, this is, to build on what Doug was saying, this is ask the question, the United States is the richest country on earth, but we have more poverty than any other advanced democracy, and why? And I think Desmond does a masterful job of drawing on history, research, and his own thoughts and original reporting, much of which talks about how these stereotypes, these concerns about being a sufferer, divide us and influence policy and decision making. He gives some great examples about poverty policy and programs, and how many of us, when presented just with the idea, simply fold our arms and say, yeah, we could do that, but then they just waste the money. So the concept of giving somebody something on the street, a homeless person or a street person, and saying, I could give them $1, but then they just, I'd feel like a sucker if they took that money and spent it on something illicit. So it's one of the reasons that I think we want everybody to read Foolproof, or CEOs or directors. It's a great work about human insight, decision making, and bargaining. And I think this will really help people understand a bit about themselves. And I know Doug and I really enjoyed it. So the book is Foolproof. Tess, Wilkinson, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on Conversations with Authors and Innovators. And for folks who are listening, get the book.
Thank you so much for having me. This is super fun.
Thanks, Tess. Thanks, Larry.